If you are interested in knowing what the best cells and armor pieces are, then stay tuned. Cells and armor are what make up your build, which translates to your strength as a slayer. Some players think that having a lot of reforges and maximizing your slayer's path are what separates the pros from the average player. However, that is all false. Your build is what will allow you to dominate in this game. I will be teaching you build theory, so that you have the knowledge to make your own loadouts. I know this video will probably be outdated after the big update, but I'm sure the thinking process that you will learn here will still prove beneficial. There are 3 things that make a great build: damage, critical chance, and attack speed. The ratio for these stats in your build are usually 4 damage perks, 1 critical chance perk, and 1 attack speed perk. It can also be 3 damage perks, 1 critical chance perk, and 2 attack speed perks. There are other combinations, but depending on where you're at in your Dauntless journey, or in very high-end play, these will change. However, these 2 are good foundations to begin with. Now that you know what makes a build good, what cells and armor pieces can help you achieve these 3 principles? Well, let's start off first with cells. I'm here to tell you that out of the 81 cells in this game, there's only a handful to pick from. The way I will format these cells are in 4 types of tiers. Good tier. These cells are top tier picks, and I will be explaining these cells thoroughly. Niche tier. Cells that can be good in specific scenarios, such as what weapon you're playing, what game mode, or what play style you want to choose. Mediocre tier. These cells are either only decent as a beginner, or they're cells that aren't as good as you think. Bad tier. Cells so bad that I won't even explain them. I will first start from the good cells, down to the bad cells. There are 5 cell categories: brutality, fortitude, alacrity, finesse, and insight. Brutality first. Our first good brutality cell is Berserker. Berserker is an amazing damage cell. It offers damage stacks in return for decrease in HP. At +3, it offers 20% damage, and at +6, it offers 35%. The good thing about this cell is that it's most efficient at +3. Unfortunately, it can only be obtained at Lady Luck's shop. This cell is not good with axe, and sometimes hammer, if you have low attack speed. Next cell, Overpower. Overpower is an amazing damage cell. It offers damage whenever a behemoth is staggered. The definition of stagger in this description does not do the cell justice. This cell doesn't just activate on a KO stagger. It can be triggered on park breaks, shock procs, interrupts, Stormclaw orb redirects, Nazaga bubble stuns, and even Boris bomber explosions. Every weapon type can use this cell, and what makes this cell even better is that because the meta strategy in this game is to staggerlock a behemoth until it dies, it suits Overpower perfectly. Sadly, that is all the good cells in brutality. I wasn't joking about there only being a handful of good ones. Next category, Fortitude. Fortitude cells revolve around defense, so none of these cells, for the most part, will be good. There is only one good defense cell in this category, and that is Parasitic. Whenever you get hit, this cell will spread out that damage slowly over a period of time, and will also give you lifesteal. This cell helps a player have the time to realize what just happened and to regain their lost HP back with that lifesteal. This cell is also most efficient at +3, it's not recommended to have it any higher. Next category, Alacrity. Our first cell in this category is Adrenaline. Adrenaline is an amazing damage perk. It gives damage depending on how low your stamina bar is. This cell is great on basically every weapon, except repeaters. It's questionable on hammer. You'll need to prime attacks to help decrease that stamina bar, since none of hammer's attacks decrease stamina, especially if the behemoth is staggerlocked, but considering most of your damage comes from the ether slam shells, priming your hits isn't the best. I'd say it's a bit harder to use Adrenaline on hammer, but it's doable. As for Warpike and Chainblades, you'd usually either only go Savagery or Adrenaline, not both. But if you're staggerlocking, then it's fine to have both, considering you won't ever be stopping to attack to let your stamina recharge. As for Chain Blades, it's fine, considering you'll need to stop every once in a while to let your stamina recharge a bit to do your best combo. However, if you're not paying attention, then the stamina regen from proccing a wound can be very bad. Next one, Assassin's Frenzy. Assassin's Frenzy is a great attack speed cell. gives 15% attack speed when you break or help break a part. Remember, there is an attack speed cap, and that cap is 50%. Attack speed is very much needed in every build. There are even some weapons that are borderline unplayable without enough speed. Now we move to the finesse category. Our first one, cunning. Cunning is a critical chance cell. Critical chance is one of the requirements we need. Cunning fits the role perfectly. However, because of the way cunning increases in value, having it at +6 is mandatory. You get way more worth of it at 6 than any other level. Next cell, Predator. Predator is a great damage cell. Can give up to 35% damage at level 6 while not taking hostile damage. Top tier cell. Does not deactivate with things like Revenant or Fire. Next cell, Pulse. Another crit chance cell. However, it works different than cunning and similar crit cells. After a X amount of attacks, your next attack will be a guaranteed crit. This cell is usually only good on axe, chainblades, strikers and repeaters. Although if you have around 16% crit chance already, then it won't be worth having this in your build, since the more crit you have, the less useful Pulse gets. Although it's fine to keep it on these 4 weapons since it's really good with weapons that hit hard in one hit like Chainblade Slam or Striker's Titan Crash Special, or weapons that hit hard frequently like Repeaters. However, you should never have this on Sword or Hammer, since these weapons have anti-synergy with this cell. Sword's small slicers from using Valiant or Avenging Overdrive can eat up your guarantee crit, which is not good. And Hammer's best damage source is its Ether Slam combo that uses your shells as damage. However, these cells don't generate pulse stacks, which makes Hammer only half as effective with pulse than with any other weapon. Our final good finesse cell is Recycle. Recycle is a damage cell that gives stacks of damage whenever you hit the same part. At +6 this can go up to 60% damage on same part, which is a lot. However, most weapons cannot use this cell properly. Except for Repeaters. Repeaters is all about focusing parts to staggerlock behemoths. If you are a repeater player, have this cell in your build, it is easily your most strongest perk. And for our final category, Insight. There is only one good general use Insight cell, and that is Reuse. Reuse is a god tier cell. It's a fantastic attack speed cell. Gives attack speed on part break, which can give a minimum of 10% and a maximum of 20% attack speed. However, the broken thing about this cell is that it stacks with itself, which is insane. Most builds have at least a +3 reuse. Now let's move on into the niche category. Brutality has no niche cells. Let's move to Fortitude. Our first niche cell, Conservation. Conservation gives shields whenever you get movement speed and then lose that movement speed. You're probably wondering how this is good. I'll explain at the end. That's all the niche cells in this category. Alacrity has a few of them. Our first one, Endurance. Endurance gives more stamina. This is only good if you already have Adrenaline in your build. Endurance will let Adrenaline's damage get even higher. Next, Fleet-footed, only good in Tempest builds. Next one, Inertia, also a cell that is only good when using Tempest. Next cell, Invigorated, mandatory on Tempest builds, can be used in other builds. Another complicated cell like Conservation, I will explain at the end. Next cell, Sprinter. Sprinter can sometimes be used in Tempest builds. Next category, Finesse. Our first one, Fire. Fire is a cell that gives attack speed and movement speed. However, you lose HP whenever you attack. This cell is usually only used in Shroud Discipline builds or Shroud Tempest ones. Next, Galvanized. God tier cell. Gives critical chance the more shields you have, and at higher ranks, gives critical damage. This cell is why Frost Wolf weapons are so damn good. Frostwolf's unique effect and Skarn Lantern can give you 1200 shields, which translates to 24% crit chance if Galvanized is at +6. That is twice more than Cunning. And you can get this even higher with stuff like Bastion Omnicell or Conservation. Amazing cell. Next one, Impulse. Another amazing cell, however only in specific conditions. Gives critical damage the more movement speed you have, caps out at 50% movement speed. This cell is amazing in Tempest builds. However, everywhere else, it really isn't used unless you use specific weapons, or when you fight in specific game modes. I will explain more at the end. Next one, Relentless. Relentless is great if you're wounding with warpike or chainblades. Makes your ether rush last longer and better overall. Remember, ether rush is the buff you get when you wound a behemoth part. This buff gives damage, movement speed, attack speed and stamina regen. Our final finesse niche cell. Savagery. This cell is a must-have if you're wounding with warpike or chainblades. Can give up to 100% damage on wounded parts. This cell gets even more insane when you're in an organized party. Your whole team can run this, and have a wounding weapon, wound for the party, allowing the whole team to take advantage of this cell. Next is, Insight niche cells. Our first one, Catalyst. This is a god tier cell. This cell is used when you start doing trials, want to speedrun kills or heroic escalations. You do have to use tonics for this cell, but it is amazing. Next cell, Conduit. Conduit gives attack speed to the whole group when you activate your lantern. Assassin's Frenzy and Reuse are way better attack speed cells, however you do have to break parts for those to activate. In heroic escalations, behemoths have so much part HP that you wouldn't use Reuse or Assassin's Frenzy there. Conduit is a decent substitute. Small note, this cell does not stack, and it also overwrites other conduits. Which mean if your +6 conduit activate, and then your teammate activates their level 3 conduit, his weaker effect will overwrite your +6 one. Keep this in mind when you party up. Next one, Engineer. Engineer increases the range of your pylons. This is usually only used in organized hunting groups. Organized trial groups, specifically. Next one, Molten. Molten gives attack speed, movement speed and fire immunity. Reuse usually beats it out in terms of attack speed, but the movement speed it gives can be used in Tempest builds. Our last one, Omni Surge. Omni Surge is sometimes used in Tempest trial builds. And now for mediocre cells. There aren't that many, I've already gone over the best ones. But I'll still discuss some cells that sound good, but aren't. Our first one, Ether Hunter. Ether Hunter gives damage whenever a behemoth ether charges. Most behemoths take around 60 through 90 seconds to enter this mode. There are some behemoths like Boris who don't follow this rule, but those are few. This cell is horrible, since it's completely dead in your build until the behemoth activates it. Also, fights should not be that long. Next one, Bladestorm. Bladestorm gives flat part damage. This is horrible because remember, adding part damage to your build will not increase your kill times. Part damage does not hurt behemoths, it just hurts behemoth parts. Next one is Sharpened. Sharpened is the same problem, except this one is a percentage increase. Cells like this that increase part damage, wound damage or stagger damage are bad. These don't compete with a cell that gives raw damage, since raw damage increases not only your actual damage, but as well as these other damage types. Knockout King is a similar cell. Gives stagger percentage. Next cell, Rage. Rage gives 20% damage whenever you get hit. This is not at all good. Not only is the cooldown horrible, but you have to get hit to activate it. Which means you can't use Predator with this cell, and you already know that Predator is a great damage cell that gives 35% damage. Also, usually whenever you get hit, it'll be in a situation where you did not expect it. You won't be able to take advantage of that 20% damage, considering you're probably getting destroyed by the behemoth. Maybe only good as a beginner if you have no better brutality cells. Next cell, Rage Hunter. Rage Hunter gives damage whenever a behemoth enrages. This cell is bad for the same reason Ether Hunter is bad. A buff that is only triggered by the behemoth. Although enraged is easier to trigger since most behemoths enrage when you take away around 25 to 30% of their HP. However, still not recommended. Next cell, Reduce. Gives damage in return for attack speed. Attack speed in this game is very important. The damage may seem tempting, but you're just having to overcompensate for attack speed. Next one, Tenacious. Tenacious is a very good damage cell. If you're a beginner, you would stop using this as you get better gear. Next one, Aegis. Aegis gives extra shield gain, and at higher levels. It gives immunity to one attack. This cell is confusing. When it says it gives higher shield gain, that does not mean that you generate a higher amount of shields. It just means that you generate those shields faster. You are not breaking your cap. This cell can be used in heroic escalation bastion builds for survivability. Next one, Tough. Tough gives you more HP. This cell is only considered when paired up with Tenacious. But even then, the synergy between these two cells still don't give you that much damage. And that's it. Any cell that I did not mention is terrible. There are a lot of bad ones. And now for those complicated cells. Conservation, Invigorated, Impulse. Conservation gives shields whenever you gain movement speed and then lose that speed. Invigorated gives movement speed whenever your stamina bar reaches 50% or lower. And Impulse gives critical damage the more movement speed you have, and it capping at 50%. The most complicated one here being Impulse. These cells by themselves are trash, but when you combine them with each other, it becomes something special. Invigorated and Impulse are always used in Tempest builds. However, things get complicated when you want to use Impulse in a non-Tempest build. A lot of you are probably thinking that Impulse is amazing and is easy to trigger with something like Invigorated. However, for Impulse to even be worth it, you need 3 things. You need damage, movement speed and a lot of critical chance. And remember, your build will naturally need attack speed perks too, which makes it almost impossible to fit the requirements for Impulse into a build and also your regular build principles. I'm about to get into a big discussion about this cell involving math, so get ready, or you can also just skip ahead. So, technically, every weapon can use Impulse, if they're either in escalations, or Blaze works, although they'll be forced to use Frostwolf weapons, but even then, there are better weapons that can use Impulse much better. And those 3 weapons being Chainblades, Warpike, and Axe. Chainblades can use Impulse well because Chainblades can make wounds. Remember, Impulse needs damage, movement speed, and critical chance. Since Chainblades can make wounds, you are able to use Savagery, which gives 100% to a wounded part. And wounding itself gives around 15% damage, 15% attack speed, 15% movement speed, and stamina regen. Which is perfect. Remember, the movement speed cap for Impulse is 50%. And Impulse itself at +6 gives up to 10% movement speed for free. So that's 15% from wounding, 10% from Impulse which goes up to 25%. Which isn't enough until you take into account that most escalations have a talent tree point you can slot in that gives 15% movement speed. Bringing it up to 40%, which is a respectable amount. You don't even need to run a +3 Invigorated, which is something you'd normally do. Unless you plan to hunt outside of escalations. In which case you'll lose that extra 15% and drop back to 25%. But if that's the case, then you can just slot in a +3 Invigorated to bring you up to 45%. And if you have repeater reforges, then it gets even better, since the reforge buff repeaters gives as movement speed. Which does get you to that 50% if you have enough 10 reforges. Although you'll still need a lot of crit chance, which means you'll probably still need to use Frostwolf Chainblades. Warpike has the same strengths as Chainblades, but it kicks it up a notch. Not only does Warpike get all this, but Warpike has a special that can give up to 30% critical chance, but it also has a mod that can bring up that 30% to a 37.5%, which is bananas. Warpike does not have the weakness of needing to use Frostwolf weapons. Although you still could if you wanted to, and it would get even crazier. And as for Axe, Axe has the damage situation covered that Impulse needs. Axe's determination meter can give you 50% damage, and if you use the overcharged cylinder mod, this goes up to 75%. Although you will be forced to use Frostwolf weapons, as well as slot in a +3 Invigorated in your build. You can also slot in a conservation to help get your crit chance up since you'll be using Frostwolf Galvanized. Small note, the Blaze Works Hunting Grounds gives you a buff whenever you kill a behemoth. This buff not only lets you turn the valves of the area to summon an event, but this buff also gives you 30% movement speed. So you could also use Impulse here very well. Finally, so here's a recap on the best cells. Berserker, Overpower, Adrenaline, Assassin's Frenzy, Cunning, Predator, Pulse, Recycle and Reuse. As for the best cells that are good in specific situations, those would be Conservation, Invigorated, Impulse, Catalyst, Relentless, Savagery, and Molten. Finally, now that you know what the best cells are, let's discuss the best behemoth armor pieces. Remember, you should always pick armor based on what perk and cell slot they have. Ignore elemental resistance. We'll start at neutral, all the way down to radiant. First behemoth, Gnasher. Only its legs are good, and only good for beginners. They have tenacious and a fortitude slot. Next behemoth, Quillshot. Quillshot only has the chest piece as usable. This piece is good if you're wounding with Warpike or Chainblades since it comes with Savagery and a finesse slot. Next behemoth, Shrike. Shrike has no good armor piece. Blaze behemoths, Embermane. Embermane's helmet and chest are good for beginners since they have evasive fury for some attack speed. Both have a alacrity slot. The arms are good for adrenaline builds since it has endurance in it, and a finesse slot which is pretty good. Next, Chirag. The legs can be good for a beginner but, still, meh. Next, Hellion. The chest of Hellion has Molten and a finesse slot. The arms are also decent, they have Molten and a brutality slot. Next, Phalanx. The helmet can be used in certain Tempest trial builds, it has Omnisurge and Alacrity slot. The legs are good for Tempest builds. Has Fleet-footed and an Alacrity slot. Torgadoro. Only the arms are good. They have Overpower and a Brutality slot. Frost behemoths. Boris's gloves and legs are good for beginners. Both have Tenacious in them. The gloves have a Brutality slot, and the legs have a Finesse slot. Next one, Pangar. Pangar has no good armor. Next behemoth, Scrave. Scrave's chest and legs are good. Both have adrenaline built in. The chest has an Alacrity slot and the legs have an Insight slot. Next one, Frostwolf. Only the arms are good, specifically in Impulse Galvanized builds as discussed earlier. Lastly, Urska. Urska has no good armor. Shock behemoths. First one, Drask. Drask has no good armor. Next, Thunder Deep Drask. Also has no good armor. Stormclaw. Stormclaw's only good armor is the gloves, they have Catalyst and an Alacrity slot. Next one, Sawvit. Sawvit's boots are the only good thing. They come with Assassin's Frenzy and a finesse slot. Last one, Malkarian. Malkarian only has good gloves. They come with Predator and a finesse slot. Terra behemoths. There's only one behemoth here that has good armor. And that is Koshai. The chest and legs are good. Both have Predator and an Insight slot. The gloves can also be decent. They have Evasive Fury and a Brutality slot. Umbral behemoths. First one, Riftstalker. None of its armor is good. Shroud. Shroud's helmet is the only good thing. It has Cunning and a Brutality slot. Thrax. Thrax's chest and boots are good. Both have Cunning and a Finesse slot. Radiant behemoths. Valamir and Chronivore have no good armor. Alira. Alira's helmet has Invigorated and an Alacrity slot. Gloves have Invigorated and an Insight slot. The chest has Galvanized and a Fortitude slot. Reza Kiri. Reza Kiri has only one good armor piece, and that's its chest. It has Cunning and an Insight slot. There's also exotic armor like Tragic Echo and Skullforge, but all of these are bad. There is one special armor set that doesn't belong to any behemoth. It's called the Time Weave set. You get the Time Weave armor blueprint in Paradox Breaks, a lore node that you have to interact with. This whole set is absolutely amazing. Specifically the helmet and boots. The helmet gives Predator and a Finesse slot. Boots give Catalyst and a Brutality slot. The chest gives Overpower and a Brutality slot. The arms give Overpower and a Finesse slot. Now let's recap on some of the best general armor. Quillshot's chest, if you're wounding. Scrave's chest and boots. Koshai's chest and boots. Shroud's helmet. Razakira's chest. Malkarian's gloves. Torgadoro's gloves. Thrax's chest and boots. And the Time Weave armor set. As for what weapons you'd use, I'll quickly go over the best weapon for each element. I'm going to ignore neutral. Frost. Pangar and Frost Wolf. Pangar for early game. Frost Wolf for late game. Blaze. Hellion. Shock. Sawvit. Terra. Kara back. Umbral. Riftstalker. Radiant. It depends on what weapon and Omnicell you use. If you're using the Revenant Omnicell, you would use Reza Kiri. If you're not, you'd use Valamir. If you're repeaters, you would use Reza Kiri. Congrats, you now know everything needed to make a good build. Well, until they change everything in the new update. One final recap. Your builds need damage, critical chance, and attack speed. Predator, Berserker, Overpower, and Adrenaline can be your damage. Cunning, Pulse, and Galvanized can be your crit. Assassin's Frenzy, Reuse, Molten or Catalyst can be your attack speed. Remember, the attack speed cap is 50%. Some weapons like Strikers, Sword, and Repeaters come with attack speed. Berserker should not be put on Axe. Berserker should only be a +3 if you're using Revenant, since having it at +6 will make Revenant really weak. Pulse should not be on Sword or Hammer. Adrenaline should not be used on Repeaters. Recycle is best suited for Repeaters. You don't always need to wound with Warpike or Chainblades. Most of the time, I actually prefer not to wound. Do not make wound in Heskas, since they have a lot of wound HP, nor do you use stuff like Assassin's Frenzy and Reuse, since they also have a lot of part HP. Remember, there is no best build, it all depends on what you fight. Since having the elemental weapon advantage is always recommended, and keep in mind that elemental armor resistance is negligible, the perks and cell slots are what are important. There is also a website called Dauntless Builder, where you can check builds there, as well as send builds to each other. There is also an official Dauntless Discord, where you can find builds, spreadsheets of info, behemoth trial rotations, special leaks from the developers and much more. I highly encourage joining.